She called me naive when she took my $20,000. But when the banker looked at her and said this empire doesn't forget, her face went white as snow. The rain was hitting the windows of my small apartment that Tuesday morning when I realized the money was gone, and for a moment I just stood there staring at the empty safe, feeling something crack inside my chest that had nothing to do with the money itself. Sarah had been in my life for 15 years, since we were both struggling college students sharing ramen noodles and dreams of something better, and the key to that safe had been in her hands for the last 5 of those years because I trusted her with everything I had. The apartment around me felt smaller somehow, the modest furniture and simple decorations suddenly looking like evidence of the failure everyone already thought I was. And I could almost hear my mother's voice saying, "I told you so," even though she was 3 states away. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself coffee from the same chipped mug I had been using for years, the one Sarah always laughed about, saying I could afford better now, but I never saw the point in changing what worked. The steam rose from the cup like the breath of some dying thing, and I realized this moment had been coming for months, maybe years, building in the small spaces between us where trust used to live. Before I share what happened next, I want to know you are here with me. Just say listening in the comments, or let me know where you are listening from. I love hearing how far these stories reach, and I have a feeling you are going to want to share this one. My phone buzzed against the counter, and Sarah's name appeared on the screen like an accusation. But I let it ring because I already knew what she would say, the same thing she had been saying for months about how I never appreciated what I had, how I lived like a monk when I could live like a king. She never understood that having money and flaunting money were 2 entirely different things, that some of us learned early that the loudest voices in the room are often the emptiest, and that real power moves in silence while pretense shouts from rooftops. The message notification chimed, and I could see the preview of her text saying yes. He was sorry, that she would pay it back, that it was just a loan, but the word loan implied asking permission, and taking $20,000 from someone's safe without asking was theft no matter how you dressed it up in pretty language. I thought about the first time I had shown her that safe, how her eyes had widened when she saw the cash inside, and how I had explained that I kept emergency money there, never mentioning that it was barely a fraction of what I actually had access to. Because some truths are too big to share with people who measure worth in dollar signs. The apartment felt different now, contaminated by betrayal, and I found myself looking at everything through new eyes, seeing how Sarah had always focused on what I didn't display rather than understanding what I chose not to reveal. She had complained about my 10-year-old car, not understanding that driving something reliable and unremarkable was a choice, not a limitation, and that drawing attention to wealth was often the fastest way to lose it. My mother had raised me on stories of family members who flashed their success only to have it stolen by people they trusted, and I had learned early that the safest treasure was the one nobody knew existed. But Sarah had never understood that philosophy, had never grasped that my modesty was protection, not poverty. The rain kept falling outside, each drop like a small funeral for the friendship I thought we had, and I realized that losing $20,000 was nothing compared to losing the person I thought I knew. The person I had believed would never look at my kindness as weakness or my trust as an opportunity. I walked to the window and watched the water streak down the glass, thinking about how Sarah had always pushed me to live bigger, spend more, show more, as if she was ashamed of being associated with someone who chose simplicity over spectacle. She had introduced me to her friends as the guy who could afford anything but chose to live like a college student, and I had laughed along because I thought she was teasing, not realizing she was apologizing for me, distancing herself from what she saw as my failure to embrace success. The irony burned in my throat like acid, because if she had known the truth about what I actually controlled, what I had built over the years while she thought I was wasting my potential, she would have been singing a very different song. But I had learned from my father that true wealth whispers while fake wealth shouts, and that the people who need everyone decay. Now they have money are usually the ones who have the least of it. So I had kept my empire in the shadows where it could grow without attracting the wrong kind of attention. My phone rang again, And this time it was my mother, as if she could sense trouble from across the country the way mothers some. At times can, and I answered because avoiding her would only make her worry more, and worrying mothers have a way of showing up unannounced on doorsteps demanding explanations. She asked how I was doing in that careful way she had developed over the years, the tone that said she was checking to see if I was still disappointing her, still failing to live up to the potential she claimed to see in me but never quite believed I would fulfill. I told her I was fine, the same thing I always told her, because explaining that someone had stolen from me would only confirm her belief that I was too trusting, too naive, too willing to see the best in people who saw me as an easy target. She talked about my cousin's new promotion, my brother's latest business venture, all the ways the family was moving forward while I remained stuck in my small apartment with my small life, never knowing that I had quietly surpassed them all years ago, building something they couldn't even imagine while they were busy announcing their minor victories to anyone who would listen. After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my apartment and thought about how Sarah had always compared me to other people, wondering why I didn't drive a flashy car or live in a penthouse or wear clothes that screamed success, not understanding that I had seen what happened to people who painted targets on their backs by advertising their wealth. She had called me content with mediocrity, not realizing that what she saw as mediocrity was actually camouflage, a way of moving through the world without attracting predators or parasites. And that some of the most successful people in history had learned to hide their strength until the moment they needed to use it. The $20,000 she had taken represented 3 months of expenses for me, enough to cover rent and food and the basic necessities of the life I chose to live, but it was also a test I hadn't realized I was giving. A way of seeing who Sarah really was when she thought nobody was watching. She had failed that test spectacularly, revealing herself to be exactly the kind of person I had spent years learning to avoid, the kind who saw kindness as weakness and trust as an invitation to take advantage. I made another cup of coffee and thought about my father, who had built his first business from nothing and then lost it because he trusted the wrong partner, a man who smiled at family dinners and stole from the company's safe on weekends until there was nothing left to steal. My father had died still bitter about that betrayal, still angry at himself for being foolish enough to believe that shared meals and friendly conversations meant anything when real money was on the table, and I had promised myself I would never make the same mistake. But here I was, standing in my kitchen, holding the same kind of pain he had carried, feeling the same mixture of disappointment and rage that comes from learning that someone you loved never really saw you as anything more than an opportunity. The difference was that my father had put everything into that one business, had no backup plan when it fell apart, while I had learned to spread my interests across multiple ventures, multiple accounts, multiple safety nets that Sarah knew nothing about. The afternoon stretched out before me like an empty road, and I realized I had to decide what to do about Sarah, whether to confront her directly or let her think she had gotten away with it, while I quietly removed her access to everything else in my life. Part of me wanted to call her immediately and demand an explanation, to give her the chance to apologize and maybe find a way back to the friendship we used to have, but another part of me knew that trust was like a broken bone that never quite healed right, always a little weaker at the place where it had been shattered. I thought about the time she had questioned my financial signs, wondering why I didn't invest in flashier things, not knowing that I had investments she couldn't even comprehend, partnerships and holdings that generated more money in a month than she made in a year. She had seen my simple life and assumed simple means, had looked at my modest choices and concluded modest resources, never considering that maybe I had learned something about wealth that she hadn't figured out yet. My laptop chimed with an email notification, and I saw it was from Marcus, my oldest friend and the one person who knew the truth about what I had built over the years, asking if I was still planning to attend the banking conference next week, the one where we would be discussing some of the larger investments and partnerships that kept my empire growing in the background of my deliberately ordinary life. I smiled for the first time that day, Thinking about how Sarah would react if she knew that while she was stealing $20,000 from my apartment safe, I was managing assets worth more than she could count, working with people who moved millions of dollars with a phone call and never felt the need to announce it to the world. The conference would be full of people like me, people who had learned that real wealth was quiet wealth, that true power came from being underestimated rather than overestimated, and that the people who needed everyone to know they were successful were usually the ones who weren't. I started typing GA response to Marcus, confirming that I would be there, and as I wrote, I realized that Sarah had actually done me a favor by showing me who she really was before I trusted her with anything that actually mattered. $20,000 was a small price to pay for that kind of clarity, for the understanding that she had been performing friendship while shopping for opportunities, smiling at my choices while judging my priorities, and waiting for the right moment to take what she thought I wouldn't miss. The truth was that I wouldn't miss the money, but I would miss the person I thought she was, the friend I had believed would never look at my generosity as gullibility or my trust as a green light to steal. She had revealed herself to be exactly the kind of person my father had warned me about, the kind who confused access with ownership and kindness with permission to take whatever they wanted. That evening, as I was making dinner in my small kitchen, Sarah finally called instead of texting, and I called hear the false brightness in her voice as she asked how my day had been, as if she didn't know exactly how my day had been, as if she hadn't been the one to poison it with her betrayal. I let her talk, listening to her describe her own day with the kind of detail that people use when they're trying to fill silence with noise, and I wondered if she was waiting for me to mention the missing money or if she was hoping I wouldn't notice for a while longer. When she finally ran out of small talk, she asked if I wanted to grab dinner tomorrow, the same casual invitation she had been making for years, and I realized she was testing me, trying to see if I knew what she had done, if I had discovered her theft yet, or if she still had time to figure out her next move. I told her I was busy, which was true enough, and after we hung up I sat in my living room thinking about how strange it was to discover that someone you had trusted completely had been lying to you for months, maybe years, seeing you as a resource rather than a friend. The next morning brought sunshine and a call from my banker, David Chun, who had been managing some of my accounts for the past 5 years and had become something of a friend in the process, one of the few people who understood that my modest lifestyle was a choice rather than a necessity. He was calling to discuss some recent developments in one of my larger investments, a manufacturing company that had just landed a contract that would triple its value over the next 2 years. And as we talked, I found myself thinking about how Sarah would react if she knew that while she was congratulating herself on stealing $20,000, I was discussing gains that would dwarf her annual salary. David mentioned that he would be at the banking conference next week, and we made plans to meet for lunch to discuss some new opportunities that had come across his desk, the kind of opportunities that were only available to people with serious money to invest. People who could move quickly when the right deal presented itself. After I hung up with David, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity, a choice that felt both inevitable and liberating, like finally admitting a truth I had been avoiding for months. I was going to let Sarah think she had gotten away with it, let her believe that her theft had gone unnoticed, and then I was going to give her exactly what she had asked for by taking from me, a front row seat to the discovery of who I really was and what she had really done. The banking conference would be perfect for this, a gathering of serious financial people in a setting where Sarah would be completely out of her depth, where her small-time thinking would be exposed for what it was, and where the truth about my actual resources would become impossible to hide. I called Marcus and asked if he could arrange for Sarah to be invited to the conference reception, telling him I wanted to introduce her to some business contacts, and he agreed without asking questions because he trusted me to know what I was doing. I spent the next few days acting normal, returning Sarah's calls and texts with the same casual friendliness I had always shown her, never mentioning the missing money or changing my behavior in any way that would alert her to the trap I was setting. She seemed relieved that I wasn't acting sus beside us, and I could almost see her relaxing as the days passed without any confrontation, probably thinking she had pulled off the perfect crime, stolen from someone who trusted her too much to check his own safe very often. The irony was delicious in a bitter way, because if she had simply asked me or the money, I would have given it to her without question, would have helped her through whatever crisis had driven her to theft, but instead she had chosen to betray me, to cross a line that could never be uncrossed, and now she would have to live with the consequences of that choice. On Thursday, I called Sarah and casually mentioned the banking conference, telling her that I had been invited to a reception and asking if she wanted to come with me, framing it as a chance for her to network with some interesting people in the financial world. She seemed surprised that I would be invited to an event, probably because she still saw me as someone who barely qualified for a business checking account, but she agreed to come, and I could hear the curiosity in her voice as she wondered what kind of people I might know in that world. I told her to dress professionally, that these were Sarah's business people who would expect a certain level of presentation, and she laughed and said she would try not to embarrass me, not realizing that the embarrassment was going to flow in the opposite direction when the truth came out. We made plans for her to pick me up on Saturday morning, and After we hung up, I sat back in my chair and thought about how perfect it was that she would be driving me to her own reckoning, delivering herself to the moment when her betrayal would be exposed and her assumptions about me would be shattered. Friday passed quietly, with Sarah texting me a few times about what to expect at the conference, asking if I knew anyone important who would be there, clearly fishing for information about my connections in the financial world. I kept my answers vague, telling her we would just have to see who showed up, but inside I was thinking about David, Chun, and Mark. Us and the other people who would be there, people who knew exactly what I was worth and would treat me accordingly, people who would make it impossible for Sarah to maintain her illusions about my modest means and limited resources. I went to bed that night feeling something I hadn't felt in years. A mixture of anticipation and justice that reminded me of Christmas morning when I was a child, that sense of knowing something wonderful was about to happen, something that would change everything. The only difference was that this time, the gift I was about to receive was the truth about someone I had trusted, and the gift I was about to give was the same truth turned back on her like a mirror she couldn't avoid looking into. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and perfect weather, as if the universe was cooperating with my plan, and I dressed carefully in my best suit, the one I saved for truly important occasions, knowing that today would qualify as one of those days that divides a life into before and after. Ra arrived exactly on time, looking professional and confident in a way that made me think she was taking this more seriously than I had expected. And I wondered if she was already planning how to use whatever connections she made at the conference to advance her own interests. We drove toward the hotel where the conference was being held, making small talk about the weather and her work, and I found myself studying her profile as she drove, looking for signs of guilt or nervousness, but she seemed perfectly at ease, completely comfortable with the lie she was living, the friendship she was betraying with every smile and casual comment. As we pulled into the hotel parking lot, Sarah made a comment about how fancy the place was, how expensive it must be to hold a conference there, and I could see her doing the calculations in her head, trying to figure out how someone like me had gotten invited to an event in such an upscale venue. I simply nodded and said that sometimes appearances could be deceiving, that things weren't always what they seemed on the surface, and she laughed and said that was true enough, completely missing the deeper meaning of what I was telling her. We walked through the lobby together, past the marble Lois and crystal chandeliers, and I could see her looking around with the kind of wide-eyed appreciation that comes from being somewhere you don't quite belong, somewhere that costs more money than you're comfortable spending. The registration desk was busy with well-dressed people checking in for various events, and when I gave my name to the woman behind the counter, she smiled and handed me a VIP badge, the kind that came with access to exclusive sessions and networking events, the kind that cost more than Sarah made in a month. Sarah stared at the badge in my hand, clearly confused about how I had qualified for VIP status, and I could see the questions forming in her mind, the first cracks in her assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of. We rode the elevator to the conference floor in silence, and I could feel her looking at me differently, trying to reconcile the person she thought she knew with the person who was apparently important enough to be treated as a VIP at a high-level banking conference. The elevator doors opened onto a scene of controlled chaos. Dozens of people in expensive suits moving between meeting rooms and networking areas. The kind of people who made million-dollar decisions over coffee and handshakes. And I watched Sarah's face as she realized we were about to walk into a world she had never imagined I belonged to. This was the moment everything would begin to change, when the careful facade I had maintained for years would start to crumble, revealing the truth that would make her theft seem not just wrong but utterly foolish, a crime committed against someone who could have helped her in ways she never dreamed possible. I took her arm gently and guided her toward the main reception area, where I could already see David Chun standing near the bar, talking to a group of people I recognized from previous conferences, people who controlled more money than Sarah could comprehend, and I knew that in just a few minutes her world was going to tilt off its axis in a way that would change everything between us forever. David Chin spotted me immediately and his face lit up with genuine warmth, the kind of recognition that comes from years of successful business together. And he excused himself from his conversation to walk over to us with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was dealing with. Sarah, what? Shed this interaction with growing confusion, clearly wondering how I knew someone who looked like he belonged in boardrooms and corner offices, someone whose handshake carried the weight of serious money and serious connections. David embraced me like an old friend, which he was, and when he shook Sarah's hand, his smile was polite but professional, the kind of courtesy he showed to the plus ones of his important clients. Never guessing that she was the reason we were having this conversation today, he immediately began talking about the manufacturing deal we had discussed, mentioning numbers T. That made Sarah's eyes widen, figures that represented more money than she had ever seen in one place. And I could see her trying to process how someone she thought was barely getting by was casually discussing million-dollar investments with a banker who clearly respected his judgment. As David Conti knew, talking about market opportunities and portfolio diversification, I found myself remembering how this all started, how I had built my first business from nothing more than an idea and a willingness to work 18-hour days while my friends were out enjoying their 20s. Sarah had known me during those early years, had seen me eating ramen noodles and sleeping on couches, but she had never stuck around long enough to see what came after, never bothered to ask why I suddenly had money for a nice apartment and a reliable car. Assuming I had gotten lucky with some small business venture rather than understanding that I had systematically built something that could generate wealth while I slept. The first company had been a consulting firm that specialized in helping small businesses optimize their operations, and while it looked boring from the outside, it had connected me with dozens of entrepreneurs who needed capital and expertise. Opportunities that had multiplied into a network of investments and partnerships that Sarah couldn't even imagine. I watched her face as David mentioned my involvement in the tech startup that had just gone public. A company I had invested in during its second round of funding when Sarah thought I was wasting my time with computer people and their ridiculous ideas about changing the world. She had laughed at my excitement about artificial intelligence and automation, had rolled her eyes when I talked about the potential for companies that existed entirely in the digital space, never understanding that I was positioning myself at the center of a revolution that would create more wealth in 10 years than traditional industries had generated in 50. The startup had returned 30 times my initial investment, enough money to fund a dozen more ventures, but I had never mentioned it to Sarah, because I had learned that talking about success was often the fastest way to lose it, that the people who needed everyone to know about their wins were usually the ones who had the fewest of them. Marcus appeared at my elbow as if summoned, his presence commanding the kind of attention that comes from controlling serious money for serious people, and when he greeted me, the entire conversation shifted to accommodate his importance. other people drifting closer to hear what the managing partner of one of the city's most exclusive investment firms had to say. Sarah looked like she was watching a movie about someone else's life, her expression shifting between confusion and something that might have been fear as she realized she was surrounded by people who operated on a level she had never imagined. People who moved millions of dollars with casual phone calls and treated wealth like a tool rather than a destination. Marcus immediately launched into a discussion about the real estate portfolio we had been building together, mentioning properties in 3 different states and a commercial development project that would break ground next month, investments that represented more money than Sarah made in 5 years. And I could see her doing the math in her head, trying to figure out how the person she thought was barely scraping by was apparently a major player in multiple industries. The conversation flowed around us like water around rocks, and I found myself thinking about my father again, about how proud he would have been to see me in this room, surrounded by people who respected my judgment and sought my partnership, people who understood that real wealth was built slowly and carefully rather than stumbled into accidentally. He had always told me that money was like water, that it flowed toward people who knew how to create the right conditions for it, and that the secret was not to chase it, but to build something so valuable that it had no choice but to come to you. I had taken that lesson to heart, had spent years creating value for other people before I ever expected anything in return. And now I was reaping the rewards of that patience, that willingness to plant seeds that would take years to grow into trees that could bear fruit for decades. Sarah hadn't said a word for 10 minutes, just stood there listening to conversations that might as well have been in a foreign language. Discussions of market capitalization and liquidity events and regulatory compliance that revealed a world she had never known existed, a world where I apparently belonged, and she was clearly an outsider. I could see her looking at me differently now, trying to reconcile the person she thought she knew with the person who was being treated as an equal by people who controlled more money than most countries, and I wondered if she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had done. The scale of the betrayal she had committed against someone who could have helped her in ways she never imagined possible. When David mentioned the private equity fund we were launching together, focusing on sustainable energy projects that would generate returns for the next 30 years, Sarah actually took a step back. As if the numbers being discussed were physically overwhelming, too big to process while standing in the same conversation. I remembered the day I had made my first million. Not from any one deal, but from the accumulation of dozens of smaller successes. Investments and partnerships that had compounded over time until the numbers stopped feeling real and started feeling like responsibility. Sarah had been going through a rough patch that year, struggling with debt and career disappointments, and I had wanted to help her but hadn't known how to do it without revealing the extent of my resources, without making her feel like a charity case or changing the dynamic of our friendship. So I had kept quiet, had continued, living my modest lifestyle while my wealth grew in the background, and I had told myself that someday I would find the right way to help her, the right moment to share what I had built, never imagining that she would choose to steal from me instead of simply asking for help. The irony was bitter and perfect, because if Sarah had come to me and explained that she needed $20,000, I would have given it to her without hesitation. Would have found a way to frame it as a business loan or an investment opportunity so she could maintain her dignity while solving her problems. Instead, she had chosen to see me as a mark, someone too trusting and too naive to protect what he had, never understanding that what she had stolen was pocket change compared to what I actually controlled, less than I spent on a single business dinner. A rounding error in a portfolio that generated more than her salary every month. The $20,000 she had taken from my safe was literally less than the interest I earned on my investments in a typical week. But she had no way of knowing that because I had worked so hard to hide my success from people who might want to take advantage of it. Marcus excused himself to take a phone call, mentioning that he was expecting an update on the biotech acquisition we had been discussing, another deal worth more money than Sarah could comprehend, and as he walked away I could see her staring after him. probably wondering how I knew someone who casually mentioned acquisitions the way most people talked about their lunch plans. David filled the silence by asking about my thoughts on the cryptocurrency market. Knowing that I had been one of the early investors in several projects that had generated massive returns, investments that had seemed crazy at the time but had proven to be prescient as digital currencies became mainstream. I gave him my usual measured response, talking about diversification and risk management. But inside I was thinking about how Sarah had mocked my interest in cryptocurrency, had called it fake money for people who didn't understand real investing, never knowing that my fake money had generated more real wealth than her traditional investments ever would. The hotel staff began setting up for lunch, and David invited us to join his table, mentioning that we would be sitting with several other people I knew from the industry, people whose names Sarah might recognize from financial news and business magazines, people who controlled funds and managed portfolios worth billions of dollars. As we walked toward the dining area, Sarah finally found her voice, asking me quietly how I knew all these people, and I could hear the confusion and something else in her tone. Maybe the first hint of understanding that she had made a terrible mistake in her assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of. I told her the truth, or at least part of it, explaining that I had been involved in various business ventures over the years, that I had been fortunate with some investments, downplaying everything in the same way I always had. But she was beginning to see through the modesty to the reality underneath. We sat down at a table that represented more accumulated wealth than most small countries, and I found myself thinking about the path that had brought me here. The years of careful planning and strategic thinking that had built something Sarah had never suspected existed. It had started with that first consulting business, the one that had taught me how to identify opportunities and inefficiencies in other people's operations, skills that had naturally led to investment opportunities as my clients grew and needed capital for expansion. I had learned to spot potential in people and businesses that others overlooked, to provide value in ways that created lasting relationships rather than quick profits. And those relationships had become the foundation of everything that followed, a network of trust and mutual benefit that generated opportunities faster than I could pursue them. The conversation at lunch was exactly what I had expected, a mixture of industry gossip and serious business discussion, people sharing insights about market trends and regulatory changes that could affect their investments. The kind of information that was worth millions to the people who heard it first. Sarah sat quietly through most of it, clearly out of her depth but trying to follow along, and I could see her looking at me with new eyes every time someone asked for my opinion on a deal or a market opportunity. Every time the conversation revealed another layer of my involvement in the financial world she was only now discovering. When the CEO of the manufacturing company I had invested in stopped by our table to thank me personally for my support and to update me on the progress of the expansion project, Sarah actually looked like she might faint. The color draining from her face as she realized she was sitting next to someone who was treated as an equal by people who ran major corporations. After lunch, David suggested we move to the VIP lounge for coffee and more private conversations. And as we walked through the hotel, I could feel Sarah's eyes on me, studying me like she was seeing me for the first time, trying to understand how someone she had thought she knew completely had been living a double life right in front of her. The lounge was quieter and more exclusive, filled with people who looked like they belonged on the covers of business magazines. And when David introduced us to his other clients, I could see Sarah's shock growing with each handshake. Each casual mention of deals and investments that dwarfed anything she had ever imagined being part of. These were people who moved money like chess pieces, who thought in terms of decades rather than quarters, who understood that real wealth was built through patience and expertise rather than luck and timing. I found myself remembering the exact moment I had realized I was wealthy, not just comfortable or successful, but genuinely rich in a way that would change everything about how I could live and what I could accomplish. It had been during a conversation with my accountant, when he had shown me the numbers and explained that my various investments and business interests had crossed a threshold that put me in a different category entirely. that I was no longer someone who worked for money, but someone whose money worked for him. The realization had been both thrilling and terrifying, because I understood that wealth brought responsibility as well as opportunity, that having resources meant being responsible for using them wisely, for creating value rather than just accumulating assets. Sarah had been there during that period, had seen me working long hours and traveling frequently, but she had interpreted my busy schedule as evidence that I was struggling to make ends meet rather than understanding that I was building something that would provide security for the rest of my life. She had worried about me, had suggested that I find a more stable job with better hours, never realizing that I was already more financially secure than most people with traditional careers. That my unconventional path was generating the kind of wealth that would let me retire before I was 40 if I chose to. The concern had been touching, but also frustrating, because it revealed how little she understood about what I was actually doing, how completely she had missed the significance of the opportunities one was pursuing. As the afternoon wore on, more people approached our group, drawn by the gravitational pull of serious money and serious connections, and each introduction revealed another aspect of my business life that Sarah had never suspected. There was the venture capitalist who had co-invested with me in 3 different startups, the real estate developer who had partnered with me on a mixed-use project downtown, the hedge fund manager who regularly sought my advice on emerging markets. People who represented billions in combined assets and who treated me as a trusted peer rather than a lucky amateur. Sarah watched these interactions with growing amazement, and I could see her starting to understand that what she was witnessing wasn't accidental or temporary, that I had built something substantial and lasting, something that would continue generating wealth and opportunities long after we were all gone. The final revelation came when Marcus returned from his phone call with news that the biotech acquisition had been approved, that our consortium had successfully purchased a company that would be worth 10 times what we paid for it within 5 years. And as he shook my hand and congratulated me on another successful deal, I could see Sarah doing the math in her head, trying to calculate what my share of that success might be worth. The numbers were staggering, more money than she had ever dreamed of having, and I could see the exact moment when she realized that the $20,000 she had stolen from me was less than what I probably made in interest while she was stealing it. Less than a rounding error in a portfolio that generated wealth faster than most people earned salaries. We stayed at the conference until late afternoon, and by the time we were ready to leave, Sarah looked like she had been through an emotional car crash, overwhelmed by everything she had learned about the person she thought she knew, stunned by the realization that she had committed a petty crime against someone who could have solved all her financial problems with a single phone call. As we walked back to her car, she was quiet in a way that felt different from her usual silence, heavy with the weight of understanding what she had done and who she had done it to, and I could almost see her mind working, trying to figure out how to apologize for something that couldn't be apologized away, how to fix something that couldn't be fixed with words or promises. The drive back to my apartment was tense with unspoken truths, and I found myself thinking about what would happen next, how this revelation would change everything between us. Whether there was any way to salvage a friendship that had been built on such fundamental misunderstandings about who we were and what we meant to each other. Sarah kept glancing at me while she drove, clearly wanting to say something but not knowing how to begin, and I realized that the hardest part was still ahead of us. The conversation where she would have to admit what she had done, and I would have to decide whether forgiveness was possible or whether some betrayals were too deep to heal. As we pulled into my parking lot, I could see her hand shaking on the steering wheel, and I knew that tomorrow would bring either the end of our friendship or the beginning of something completely different, something built on truth rather than assumptions, on reality rather than the comfortable lies we had been telling ourselves for years. But tonight, we would both have to sit with what had been revealed, with the knowledge that everything we thought we knew about each other had been wrong, and that the $20,000 she had stolen was just the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape both our lives in ways we couldn't yet imagine. We sat in her car for a long moment after she turned off the engine, the silence stretching between us like a chasm that had been there all along, but only now was visible, and I could see her struggling with how to begin the conversation that we both knew was inevitable. The afternoon shadows were rowing longer across the parking lot, and somewhere in the distance I could hear children playing, their laughter a sharp contrast to the weight of what was about to unfold between us in the confined space of her sedan. Sarah's hands were still gripping the steering wheel even though we weren't moving, her knuckles white with tension, and when she finally turned to look at me, her eyes were filled with something I had never seen there before, a mixture of shame and fear and desperate hope that maybe she could still find a way out of what she had done. She opened her mouth twice before any words came out, and when they did, her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it, barely above a whisper, as she said she needed to tell me something she should have told me days ago, but hadn't known how to say. I waited, giving her the space to confess what we both knew she had taken, but also knowing that whatever words she chose wouldn't change the fundamental fact of what had happened between us, wouldn't erase the betrayal or restore the trust that had been the foundation of our friendship for 15 years. She started by saying she was sorry, the most inadequate word in the English language for what she had done, and then she began to explain about her debts, about the credit cards and the loan payments and the mounting pressure that had made her think taking money from my safe was somehow justified. As she talked, I found myself thinking about all the times she could have a sigh. MPLY asked me for help. All the conversations where she had complained about money while sitting next to someone who could have solved her problems without even feeling the impact. But instead she had chosen to see me as a victim rather than a friend, someone to be stolen from rather than someone to trust with her troubles. The confession spilled out of her in pieces, fragments of justification mixed with genuine remorse, and I could see her trying to make me understand how desperate she had felt, how the $20,000 had seemed like such a small amount to someone who lived so modestly, someone who never seemed to spend money on anything beyond basic necessities. She talked about watching me wear the same clothes for years, drive the same old car, live in the same simple apartment, and how she had convinced herself that I wouldn't even notice the money was gone, that it was sitting there unused while she was drowning in debt that was destroying her sleep and her peace of mind. The irony was so complete it was almost beautiful, because she had stolen from someone who could have given her 10 times that amount without thinking twice. Someone who had been carefully maintaining a modest lifestyle precisely to avoid the kind of attention that led to people seeing him as a source of easy money. When she finished talking, I sat quietly for a moment, looking out at the ordinary parking lot of my ordinary apartment complex, thinking about how this conversation was taking place in such a mundane setting when it represented the end of something that had been important to both of us for so long. I told her I knew about the money, had known since the day she took it, and I watched her face crumble as she realized that I had been carrying this knowledge for days while she had been pretending everything was normal, lying to my face while I already knew the truth about what she had done. She asked why I hadn't said anything immediately, and I explained that I had wanted to understand who she really was, wanted to see if she would confess on her own or if she would continue lying to someone she claimed to care about, and that the conference had been a test as much as a revelation, a way of showing her exactly what she had stolen from and who she had betrayed. The weight of what she had learned that day finally seemed to hit her all at once, and she began to cry, not the gentle tears of someone who was sorry for hurting a friend, but the harsh sobs of someone who had just realized the magnitude of their own stupidity, the scale of the opportunity they had destroyed through their own greed and poor judgment. She kept saying she didn't know, repeating it like a mantra that might somehow excuse what she had done. But we both understood that ignorance wasn't really an excuse, that if she had cared enough to really know me, she would have seen the signs of my success, would have noticed the discrepancies between my modest lifestyle and my obvious financial security. I let her cry without offering comfort, because some lessons can only be learned through pain, and she needed to feel the full impact of what she had done before she could begin to understand the person she had betrayed and the friendship she had thrown away for such a small amount of money. He finally composed herself enough to speak. She asked what would happen now, whether I was going to call the police or press charges. And I could hear the fear in her voice as she realized that theft from someone with my resources might be treated very differently than theft from someone she thought was barely getting by. I told her the truth, that I wasn't interested in revenge or punishment, that the $20,000 meant nothing to me financially, but that her betrayal had cost her something much more valuable than money. Something that couldn't be stolen or bought or replaced once it was gone. She looked confused, and I explained that she had lost my trust, my friendship, and my respect, that she had revealed herself to be the kind of person who would steal from someone who had never been anything but generous with her, and that those losses were permanent in a way that financial losses never were. She begged me to give her another chance, promising to pay back the money with interest, swearing that she would never do anything like this again, but I could see in her eyes that she still didn't understand the real problem. Still thought this was about money when it was actually about character, about the kind of person she had chosen to be when she thought nobody was watching. I told her about my father, about how he had been betrayed by someone he trusted, and how that betrayal had poisoned the rest of his life because he had never been able to trust anyone completely again. And I explained that I refused to carry that kind of bitterness, that I would rather end our friendship cleanly than let it rot slowly from the inside. She started to argue, to explain again about her debts and her desperation, but I held up my hand and told her that I understood her problems, that I could have helped her with all of them if she had simply asked, but that choosing to steal instead of ask revealed something about her character that couldn't be explained away by financial pressure. The conversation was interrupted by my phone ringing, and when I saw David Chin's name on the screen, I answered, partly because it was important and partly because I wanted Sarah to hear one more confirmation of who I really was and what she had really done. David was calling to finalize the details of Monday's meeting about the biotech acquisition, discussing numbers that represented more money than Sarah made in several years. And as I talked to him, I could see her face changing, the last of her denial crumbling, as she fully grasped the scale of what I controlled and what she had risked for such a pathetically small amount. When I hung up, she looked at me like she was seeing a stranger, and I realized that in many ways she was, because the person she thought she had known for 15 years had never really existed, had been a careful construction designed to protect the real me from exactly this kind of betrayal. I got out of the car and walked around to her window, and when she rolled it down I could see that she was crying again, but these tears were different, quieter, and more hopeless. The tears of someone who had just realized they had destroyed something precious through their own stupidity and greed. I told her that I didn't hate her, that I understood how financial pressure could make people do things they never thought they would do, but that understanding didn't mean forgiveness, didn't mean we could go back to the way things were before she had chosen to see me as a mark instead of a friend. He asked if there was anything she could do to fix this, and I told her the truth, that some things couldn't be fixed, that trust was like a mirror that might be glued back together but would never again reflect clearly, would always show the cracks where it had been broken. As I turned to walk away, she called my name one last time, and when I looked back she asked the question I had been expecting, wanted to know why I had lived so modestly when I could afford anything I wanted, why I had hidden my success from people who cared about me, why I had chosen to be underestimated rather than celebrated. I thought about how to answer that, about whether she deserved to understand the philosophy that had guided my life and protected my wealth, and finally I decided to give her one last gift, one final lesson that might help her make better choices in whatever life she built after this. I told her that my father had taught me that money was like water, that it flowed toward people who knew how to create the right conditions for it, but that it also flowed away from people who couldn't resist the temptation to splash it around for everyone to see, and that the safest wealth was the wealth that nobody knew existed until you chose to reveal it. I explained that I had learned early that the people who needed everyone to know they were successful were usually the ones who weren't, that real wealth whispered while fake wealth shouted. and that by living modestly, I had been able to identify the people who saw kindness as weakness and generosity as an opportunity to take advantage. She had failed that test, had revealed herself to be exactly the kind of person I had been protecting myself from, someone who looked at my trust and saw permission to steal, who confused my choice to live simply with an inability to live richly. The irony was perfect and complete, because if she had passed the test, if she had proven herself to be trustworthy and genuine, I would have shared my success with her, would have made her part of my inner circle where she could have benefited from my wealth instead of stealing scraps from its edges. Walking up to my apartment, I felt something I hadn't expected, a strange sense of relief mixed with sadness, as if a weight I hadn't known I was carrying had finally been lifted from my shoulders. The friendship with Sarah had been built on a fundamental misunderstanding, her perception of me as someone who needed protection and guidance when the reality was exactly the opposite, and maintaining that illusion had required constant vigilance, constant care not to reveal too much or live too openly. Now that the truth was out, I could stop pretending to be less than I was, could stop hiding my success from someone who had proven unworthy of sharing it, and while the loss of the friendship hurt, the freedom from deception felt like breathing clean air after years in a stuffy room. I poured myself a drink and sat in my living room, thinking about how this day had changed everything, how Sarah's betrayal had forced a reckoning that had been years in the making. A moment of truth that revealed the real nature of our relationship and the real character of the people involved. She would go home, eat to her debts and her problems, having learned that stealing from the wrong person could cost much more than whatever you managed to take, and I would continue building my empire. Wiser now about the importance of choosing carefully who to trust with access to my life and my resources. The $20,000 she had stolen would be replaced in a matter of days by the normal operations of my various investments. But the lesson we had both learned would last much longer, would shape how we approached trust and friendship and money for the rest of our lives. The next morning brought emails from David and Marcus and several other people from the conference, business opportunities and investment proposals that would generate more wealth in the coming months, proof that my decision to reveal myself had opened new doors even as it had closed others. I responded to each message with the essay, "Me careful consideration I had always brought to my business dealings, evaluating each opportunity based on its merits rather than its potential for quick profit, building relationships that would last decades rather than chasing deals that might pay off quickly but leave nothing of lasting value." This was how wealth was really built, through patience and expertise and the discipline to say no to good opportunities in order to say yes to great ones, lessons that Sarah had never learned and probably never would learn, because she was still thinking like someone who needed money rather than someone who understood how to make money work for her. A week later, I received a letter from Sarah, handwritten on her personal stationery, apologizing again for what she had done and asking if there was any way we could remain friends, any possibility of rebuilding what had been broken between us. I read it twice, looking for any sign that she understood the real nature of what had happened, any indication that she grasped the magnitude of the opportunity she had destroyed through her betrayal, but the letter was filled with the same surface-level remorse she had shown in the car, focused on the money rather than the trust, on the crime rather than the character it revealed. I didn't respond, because some conversations are finished even when all the words haven't been said, and I had already given her more explanations and more chances than she deserved, had already invested more emotional energy in her education than she had ever invested in really knowing me. Instead, I focused on the future, on the investments and partnerships that would define the next phase of my life, on building something that would last long after I was gone and benefit people who had earned the right to be part of my legacy. The biotech company was developing treatments that could save billions of lives. The sustainable energy projects would help create a cleaner world for future generations, and the educational initiatives I was quietly funding would give opportunities to young people who had the intelligence and drive to make the most of them. This was what wealth was really for. Not the accumulation of things, but the creation of value. Not the display of success, but the use of resources to make the world better in ways that would outlast any individual fortune. Months passed, and occasionally I would think about Sarah, wondering if she had learned anything from our expiry. NCE, if she had found a way to solve her financial problems without betraying anyone else who trusted her, if she had developed any understanding of the difference between taking what you want and earning what you need. I heard through mutual friends that she had gotten a new job, that she was working to pay off her debts, that she seemed more serious and focused than she had been before, and I was glad for her even though I could never trust her again. Even though our friendship was one of the casualties of her choices and would remain buried no matter how much she might change or grow. The lesson wasn't about money or trust or even friendship, but about the importance of living authentically, of being honest about who you are and what you value, of understanding that hiding your light under a bushel might protect it from some people, but also prevents it from illuminating the darkness for others who might benefit from its glow. I had learned to be more selective about who I trusted with my truth, but also more generous with those who proved worthy of that trust. Creating a circle of people who knew who I really was and supported what I was trying to accomplish with my resources and my time. Sarah had taught me that some people would always see generosity as weakness and trust as an invitation to take advantage, but she had also taught me that revealing those people was part of the cost of building something meaningful, that you couldn't create lasting value without taking the risk that some people would try to steal from what you had built. The key was learning to identify those people quickly and remove them from your life before they could do serious damage, before their poison could spread to the relationships and projects that really mattered, before their small thinking could contaminate the big dreams that justified all the work and risk and sacrifice that building wealth required. As I sat in my apartment that evening, looking out at the city lights and thinking about all the opportunities that lay ahead, I realized that Sarah's betrayal had actually been a gift in disguise. A painful but necessary lesson that had taught me to value authenticity over comfort, truth over politeness, and genuine connection over the illusion of friendship built on misunderstanding and deception. The $20,000 she had stolen was the cheapest education I had ever received, and while I wouldn't have chosen to learn the lesson that way, I was grateful for the clarity it had brought to my life and my relationships. I raised my glass to the window, toasting the future and the people who would be part of it, the genuine friends and partners and collaborators who would help me build something worth building, something that would justify the trust they placed in me and the resources I had been fortunate enough to accumulate. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities and new challenge. Yes, new chances to create value and new risks to evaluate. But tonight I was content to sit in my simple apartment, surrounded by the modest possessions I had chosen to keep. Knowing that true wealth wasn't about what you owned, but about what you could accomplish, not about what you could buy, but about what you could build, not about being seen as successful, but about actually making a difference in ways that would matter long after the money was spent and the recognition was forgotten. The empire that Sarah had discovered was real, but it was also just the beginning, the foundation for Summit. Being much larger and more meaningful than any individual fortune, something that would outlast any betrayal and survive any challenge because it was built on principles rather than personalities, on value rather than vanity, on the understanding that true success was measured not by what you accumulated, but by what you contributed, not by what you took from the world, but by what you gave back to it.